Professor Eckstein, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
I'd love to start by asking you about something that Israel's finance minister, Yuval Steinitz, recently said. He said that he thinks Israel's economy this year is going to do quite well, but he's really worried about 2012, mainly because of Europe. What is your view of Europe's sovereign debt crisis and how it could affect Israel's economy?
Okay, Israel economy has been doing very well. Growth this year is expected to be 4.8, 4.9, maybe reach even 5%. Unemployment went down to 5.6. Inflation expectation forward are about 2%. So the economy in the macro sense is doing very well, and exports have been growing very well. The key threat and risk for the economy is that the demand for Israeli product abroad would go down. Europe hold about 35 to 40% of our exports. And given the slowdown expected in Europe, which is going to be quite severe, and we have seen already the ECB reducing interest rate, we have seen just the forecast on the US economy together with Europe. They are making more than 70% of the total exports. So that's the key risk, is really the reduction in Israeli growth of exports to go down to 4 or 5%, and basically that means that the economy may grow next year in the range of 3.5, and that's what he sees main of the risk. And 3.5 may cause a little bit rise back in the unemployment.
I see. Well, since we were talking about Europe and the ECB, what do you think Europe's central bankers could have done differently?
Well, it's not only the central bankers. Europe now with the euro is putting together 17 to 19 countries. And then the EU, which consists of more than 30 countries, did not really generate a central government decision-making and did not implement strongly deviation from the Maastricht Agreement of debt to GDP of 40%, of deficit less than 3%, etc., etc. And what we have seen is really Europe tackle back a big sovereign debt problems of Greece in particular, but actually more threatening is potential problems with Italy and Spain. And the key problem is that the Greece problem is already known to people who are analyzing data already from at least early 2010, if not before. And it became to the public, and markets reacted already from May 2010. And the main problem is that what has been done a few weeks ago and should have been done a year ago. Mm-hmm. And that's mainly the one important decision they made, is separating the European banking stability problem from the Greece debt default or debt potential risk. And that's what they did a few weeks ago, at least announcing they did it. And that certainly reduced the tension in the way that markets now are less sensitive to the Greece problem, because they view that June 2011, mainly all the big banks in Europe will recapitalize to a 9% with a real haircut of 50 and more % of the Greek debt, and potentially even a haircut on other debts if they would come. And that's really provide a stability of the banking sector.
What do you think is on the cards in Italy and Spain?
Well, the cards on Italy is the main problem, is that the political stability inside or instability inside generate uncertainty about the debt to GDP ratio. Italy economy has been doing not great, to say the least. Really very slow growth, even a negative growth. Debt is 115% of GDP. Deficit is not terribly high. But really to get back to a reasonable debt to GDP, back to the 60% sometimes in the foreseeable future, Italy should take important steps and to revive its economy and to reduce the current deficit. And to do that, they need to probably have a more decisive government than they have now. And as long as they don't do it, we see the markets react and spreads increase from the German debt, and they have to finance this debt on a 6% interest rate. That become going to be very, very complicated and generate an increasing debt. And if Italy debt, which is trillions of dollars, get into the area of CDS risk that we might consider below AAA, then Europe is in a real great trouble, and the rest of the world is in great trouble.
And Spain as well, you feel?
I think Spain, the feeling is that in Spain things are more stable, is more manageable. Spain, the Spanish economy is doing bad. Unemployment is extremely high. But it seems that overall the change in the political structure there would generate a path of back to normality. Also, the level of the debt they started with is much lower. So there is overall prospect of getting into instability are much lower, and also the past behavior of the Spanish governments in controlling a very responsible fiscal policy and banking regulation policy, which come back. They had one default on these local banks that generated too much household debt would be fixed. I think Spain more likely will get very soon to this year into a stable European standards.
Let's come now to this side of the pond, looking at the persistent problems in the U.S. economy. How do you expect that to affect Israeli firms?
Well, there are two aspects. Of course, Israel, more than about 30% of the Israeli export is going to the U.S. However, we are really exporting a lot to the high-tech sector. And so far, the high-tech sector has not suffered tremendously in the U.S. And therefore, the demand still was going well. And when we look at the indices of growth of the high-tech sector in the U.S., it's still keeping up, and that's where there is growth in the U.S. It's not a big growth of jobs, and therefore the U.S. economy doesn't really get a huge gain from this, but the Israeli economy does. So we see the new generation of the iPod and the iPhone and the Androids and all the different products, and Israeli high-tech sector is a key aspect there. And so overall, the slow of the U.S. economy getting back to normality, which is now foreseeable by the Fed only to the second half of 2013, is going to have some effect on the Israeli economy, but probably not tremendous effect.
Right. Well, as you have just said, Professor Eckstein, both Europe and the U.S. economies are slowing down. Do you think that one possible solution for Israel could be greater economic cooperation with Palestine and the other Middle Eastern economies? And what's your view on that?
Well, in fact, what has been going on in Israel is that as the U.S. and European economies were relatively growing slower since 2007 and even before, we have seen an export shift into the Far East. Israel exports are very high-tech. We are if you do any comparison with other countries in terms of the combination of products that we are exporting, we are really export software and machines and pharmaceuticals and other things which are on the high-tech, which is about 50% of our exports, even more. And therefore, the possibility of exporting those goods into the Middle East doesn't seem to be the opportunity for Israel. And we know that most of the trade of most developed countries is among more developed countries.
What then can be done to increase greater economic collaboration within the Middle East region?
I think the key to collaboration and the key to economic development for the Middle Eastern countries is stability, peace, and competition policies. And the key issue is stability and competition policies. And really, I think this is the main drawback of most Middle Eastern countries. And that's include the West Bank and Gaza and maybe even Jordan or Syria and Lebanon and Egypt, is really economic stability, political stability, and then economic competition promotion in the country, and also the open up of the country to imports and export and getting their comparative advantage to grow, has been the policies in most Far East countries, which came from a very low income per capita to a growth. So one of the big importance to get really the West Bank is really to provide stability for the economy there, for the rules, for rule of law, for rule of property rights, for ability to have trade within the West Bank. It's one of the main problems coming up from the instability of the political and the defense problem and the terror activity and the involvement of the Israeli army is the segmentation of this area. And what we see is really the importance of, first of all, having an internal economy working and blooming. But then the second part is really to let to them using their comparative advantage in some products and getting them exported, because really they're a small economy and they can export to Israel, but really what they can do is really developing a large export abroad and not necessarily only to Israel.
Right. Well, as you know, the political balance in the region has shifted quite a bit because of the Arab Spring. Do you think that the political shifts that have taken place in the Middle East as a result will enhance the possibility of greater economic joint development with Israel and the region, or could it hurt the situation?
I think,
why?
First of all, the spring that we see in, I think, the call in the square El Tahrir in Cairo of justice and social freedom and democracy are hard moving to anyone who has been living in the Middle East and seeing Israel as only the model of what I would say modern democracies. So just the possibility of having democracy, a pure democracy, on a style which is close to what we see in the developed world, in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya, I think would be great hope for the people there. And that's, I think, the key, what is important. It's great hope for the people. Now, how this democracy will shape into their economic policies, it's a huge question mark. I think there are two important, so if I have to mention two, and I mentioned two, I said it the other time, what we need is, first of all, stability. It's political stability, it's security stability, and it is macroeconomic stability. It's a budget policy stability and monetary policy stability. Those are necessary conditions, but they are not enough. Without promoting competition and using the comparative advantage of the country in the world trade and getting integrated in a global economy, it's hard to economy to start growing. And what we see in India, what we see in China, what we have seen in Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan many years ago, it's really this aspect that I mentioned, stability, consistent macroeconomic policy, and promotion of competition. And I hope these countries will learn the lesson, will listen to IMF advice on this aspect, and then they will grow. I think the relationship with Israel is one aspect of that. I would say with Israel, the key is to establish a stable political environment and geopolitical situation. Once we reach a stability and rather getting into debate and fighting on every little aspect, then it will grow. I mean, the key good example is the gas pipeline. I mean, there is a gas pipeline going from Egypt to Jordan and to Israel. It provides a lot of benefit to Egyptians. I mean, very cheaply. They provide us with a great gas to use for our electric production, and for Jordan, with a cheap price. They make a lot of money out of it. But then, if they cannot really control the viability and the stability of this product, it's very hard to see cooperation in other things. I can give you just one more example. I mean, Israel in the south is a desert country. Egypt in the south, in the area between Israel and Egypt, is a desert country. Egypt has a huge amount of water from the Nile for several thousand years. It's unthinkable in the geopolitical situation today to think, why would not use this water to really bloom the area? Why people think to bring water so far away from Turkey? Why not to bring the water, which is already flood from the delta to El Arish, which is just on the border? Why not to bring it into Israel, into Jordan, where we pay a huge amount for water, maybe twice as much as what it costs to transport it? But it is the history and the geopolitical and the threat, and why do you take my water to give it to you water, rather than thinking about the benefit it can bring to the people on two sides of the border. That's something that we have to really go through, and if they would be able to do it politically, it will be a huge gain.
Yeah, I think thank you for that very thoughtful answer. But speaking of protests, as you referred to, the Tahrir Square protests, Israel also during the past summer saw a lot of protests in many different cities. A lot of young people were shouting slogans against the tycoonim, I think as they are called. Tycoons. What do you think are some of the main issues, economic issues, that face young Israelis? And what policy changes are required to deal with those situations?
I think it's hard to me to say what are the underlying mechanisms that generate this protest. First of all, I'm not a sociologist or social psychologist. So I would just want to point out to an important issue which came up also with Occupy Wall Street, which came later, and which came there in Israel, and maybe to some extent in the Arab Springs. I mean, young people want to see lights in front of them. They want to work hard and to get to a better place. That has been in the last, I would say, during the 20th century or the second half of the 20th century of many young people in many places. Not all people, all places. And I think what the people at the streets of Israel, the young people, were telling us, were telling the policymakers, we don't see a hopeful light there. We see inequality, we see deterioration in the services we receive, we see a lot of people which are below poverty line, and we ourselves do not see ourselves living in the standard that we were thinking we could in terms of reaching houses and reaching support we can give to our children, support for education and so forth. And I think to some extent there is a common view about this in Wall Street. I would say that it is a populist common phenomena historically, that when things get worse and you don't see the light, then you point out to the very top people, entrepreneurs, which some of them probably earn their income legally, but using monopoly power. Maybe some of them were even, some of them were crooks and the police caught them or did not. It's easy to point out to these people, but really things are much deeper and much more complicated. And I think this aspect of actually trying to blame few people who were at the top of the earning scale in the last few years is not the way to think about changing the economy. In fact, when you look back on history, there were always some people at the top of the scale. And there were people who trying to replace them. And usually what happened is that they replaced them with other people. It didn't change the situation. I think what we have learned over time as economists is that policies set by governments which enable people equal access to opportunities and prevent monopolies and enhance competitions are the policies that enhance growth and delight for the people at the end of the road. And that's, I think, is what we try to implement in Israel, and I would say not necessarily always with great success.
Professor Eckstein, I'd love to ask you some questions now about your research. Maybe I could start with a small question about a big issue. What role has education played in shaping Jewish history?
Oh, that's a topic that we have been studying for the last more than 10 years. We are publishing a book which says The Chosen Few, How Education Shaped Jewish History. I think the Jews have made a big change in their religion very much after the destruction of the temple at the year 73, 100, where they make the learning of reading and later of writing by the boys of the Torah as the core of Judaism. And when they promoted it over the years, they basically generate a society, or the first society of mandatory education. And I think already before the turn of the millennium, almost 100% of Jewish boys knew to read, where the level of literacy on the farming societies around was at most 10%. And that provided the Jews a big advantage economically in choosing occupations that can fit their ability to read. But not only to read, I mean, basically the reading was an infrastructure to a Jewish religion which is based on the Jewish law and rabbis and a whole system of decision. And there is a Mishnah, which is the interpretation of the Torah. The Torah itself is a law. But then there is the Mishnah, which take it into details. And in the Mishnah, it says that you have to read. And then this Mishnah was interpreted by another set of law, which is the Torah, the Talmud. And then with the Talmud, there were rabbis who were using the Talmud for years, and they built on each other. And that generated an infrastructure for the Jews in the Muslim empire to start to become traders on different distances where they can write contracts. And they could, if they have a disagreement on the contracts, they could assign arbitrators, which were the rabbis. And they can move their families. And they were trading from India, from China, all the way to Spain and to England and to France, already in the 8th and 10th centuries, way before Marco Polo in the 14th century started traveling over there. And that's basically based the Jews as what's called a merchant society, urban society. And they move into being urban dwellers, earning relatively much more than most of the population around. But in the process of moving to that, they separate themselves from the other religion, which was Christianity, which they called themselves the New Jews when they started, which based on not requiring people to learn and expanding to a lot of people. And basically, the Jews live next to the Christians and to the Muslims, mainly as an urban minority that migrated from its own will to find more income and being merchants and moneylenders, doctors, etc. I mean, they continue to be leading in this aspect of the world because the rest of the world reached to mandatory education only in the early 20th century. So that was a big advantage of the Jews when they came to the U.S. In the end of the 19th century. They all came literate. So for them, growing into the education system in the U.S. was kind of a natural. So education that started with the change in the religion norm had a huge impact on the whole occupational, migration, and population size of the Jewish people. That's what we find in the book, and we document it year by year. Our book actually ended up just before where the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, 96. But we basically show that up to this period, the key reason for the Jews choosing the particular occupation they were was mainly the comparative advantage they had from literacy and their goal of building up this Jewish community and this Jewish law, rather than restrictions or as sometimes other historians and other people were saying, the Jews couldn't own land. Most time they could own land, they could be farmers, but the jobs they have chosen to do gave them much higher standard of living.
Thank you for that. You also have another very interesting book coming out next year, dealing with a wave of large-scale immigration into Israel. Could you tell us about that research and your main findings?
Yeah, in the early 1990s, when we start seeing the large wave of immigrants from the former Soviet Union to Israel, we established a group of researchers and we together collected data on their integration of the Jews immigrants who arrived from the former Soviet Union to Israel. During the decade from 1990 to 2000, about 900,000 people came, and they become like 20% of the Jewish population, and what we study is how well they integrated in the labor market. And there are several questions. One question is, do they affect negatively the natives? Always the native are afraid of immigrants. And what we document is that the negative impact on native is very minor, was very little, was maybe for a year at the beginning. And really the main reason is that the government provided them way to invest in local human capital, meaning they invested in adjusting their skills to the local market, learning the language, learning the jobs that are available in the new country, like engineers in the new country, or other jobs with the machines that are available in Israel, with the Israeli market. And very quickly they integrated into the labor market, and basically they expand the economy. And the economy expanded by their interest in working in this and learning how to work in this. So basically, by allowing them to choose their occupation, by allowing them to choose their location of study, by helping them in investment in local skills, made the integration into the economy very smooth and make the economy growing through the entire period without any downturn. So I think what we learn is if you bring immigrants, the main issue that you have to worry about is providing them the resources to invest in the local human capital to get them integrated in the labor market, and providing all the gains for the economy from their human capital to the economy.
That sounds really fascinating because, as you know, immigration is such a huge issue in Europe and many European countries and also in the U.S. What could the rest of the world learn from the way Israel dealt with this issue?
I think Israel, the way it mentioned is that you have to manage your immigration policy. And you cannot just think about immigration as whoever wants to come, we make a quota or something like this. What you have to think about is when you let people to come in, you really want to provide them the mechanism by which they can learn how to integrate into the economy. Otherwise, they may have a negative impact, especially if you bring a low-skilled people in large amounts. They really push the wage down to the low-skilled people, and that generates inequality, and that's really devastating. So what you need is to control, when you get immigrants in, you want to control the diversity, so they would come with different skills, And then when they come in, you want to make sure that they have the means how to invest in the language, in the skills required in the new country, because the market does not provide the resources for this investment. And the government investment there would pay very much through the tax system to a huge return to the whole country.
That's great. Thank you for that. I have one last question for you, Professor Eckstein. You are a labor economist. And as you know, the U.S. economy has been struggling to create jobs. If President Obama were to ask you your advice on how can the U.S. generate jobs, what would you tell him?
Well, I have to study this issue. I have to be honest. We have to really identify where are the main blocks in the labor market. And the key question always in labor market is to match demand and supply. We have a long-term unemployed, a lot of them from construction business, with a lot of experience, and relatively some of them with high wages in the past. And now we have the housing market is not really absorbing in them back. We have to study in detail what is the main blocks, what are the main problems they find. Is it the demand side, or is it the supply side in terms of adjustment of those skills? And what we learn in the labor market is that it's not just the demand and supply, it's the matching quality. You need to find the right workers to the markets. So this, I think, is today in the U.S. it's highly complicated, because what we do see already is a real problem in the demand side, because still investment and consumption and consumer and investor and public feeling and public perception of where the economy is going are not high enough to provide demand. Another thing is really, I'm not sure that the workers who are there really understand fully the opportunities and whether they invest really in the right skills for the job market that they would face given the change of the economy and the deleveraging and other things. So the one thing I want to say that I have not seen a good comprehensive research that survey this data, map the problems, and provide a good enough solution that works on the two sides, on the demand and the supply side, focus on the people who are really unemployed and search for work. And that, I think, is missing. And Alan Kruger is a good economist. He's a labor economist. In fact, most of the advisors to the government, to the president now, are labor economists, microeconomists. And I hope they do this kind of research and really study the details of what's going on. But if I want to summarize what we learn in the academic research, it's really the matching and the quality of matching between the workers and the firms. If I go back to my story on the immigrants, what we find is really the mismatch of the qualities is something we want to fix. And when we enable the two-sided to overcome that, it was much easier. One reason there in Israel it was easier that the people came from the Soviet Union were willing to work for a low wage. And that generated a lot of demand by the firms. I am afraid that one of the main problems now in the US is a lot of the people are not willing to work for a lower wage than they used to in the past. It's hard for them to do that. And that's make a problem for the firms to hire them. And in this sense, there might be a place for some subsidies on the match between workers and firms. But I want to be careful on, before I go and provide to President Obama and his advisor a menu, I'm just guessing that could be a way to look into this problem.
Professor Eckstein, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.